The Winnipeg Jets are first in the league, but they might also be the NHL's most interesting team, finding new ways to win every single game. We'll chat about why they're so interesting on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. And thanks so much again for supporting us as we are kicking off, a great start to the season. Looking forward to what should be a fun year ahead. Now, speaking of a fun year ahead, the Jets are 11-1-0. And, obviously none of us expected this. I don't even think our most optimistic fans among us expected the Jets to only have one loss to start the season, 22 points, and fairly clear ahead in first place by a good, 3 points or so, which for any team would be impressive, but especially for a Jets team under a relatively newer coach and some major offseason departures. And you can debate the merits of those departures, whether it was better for the Jets or not. But all that said, this team definitely lost some talent, and they have gone through some changes. And yet here they are sitting with the best record in the NHL. And I want to talk about why they're a particularly interesting team this year in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to let you know that you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets are one of the league's most interesting teams because I feel like we have yet to see their final form. I posted on Twitter the other day, and a lot of people, well, not that many people, but a couple of folks did get mad at me for saying this, but I said this Jets team is not really close to the 2017-2018 squad yet. And I stand by that statement for a couple of reasons. First off, it's just a comparison. If we're looking at a team with a nearly perfect record, I think it's worth chatting about, one of the best teams that this franchise has ever had. How does this team, stack up against it? More so not because, we have this huge body of evidence, but because I'm curious about what this team has done well, what they're struggling with. And Winnipeg has kind of gone from being very reliant on the power play and goaltending to suddenly being pretty good at just about everything. The offense at even strength has started to pick up. We've seen guys like Kyle Connor start to break into, above average territory if you're looking at scoring chances for and against, all that fun stuff. And the fact that he's also just, honestly, he's played like he's completely possessed this year, and that's been helpful, while maybe Scheifele looks like he's a little bit of a step behind, and Velarde is still putting his game together. So Winnipeg this year, very interesting. In my mind, I think that this team is winning in ways that we really haven't seen in some time. This squad has never had, the perfect balance until that 17-18 team. I guess 2014-15, you could argue, was pretty good. But over the years, the team has had some issues somewhere, right? If the offense was great, the defense was terrible. If the defense was great, the offense couldn't get it done. If the offense was doing well at even strength, the power play was a mystery. So, the Jets have always felt like they've been missing some component. This year's team is starting to feel like it's increasingly putting itself in a good spot to be really good all around. And it's interesting because the Jets have this approach of doing things by committee, and Garrett Hull kind of pointed this out, but I've also noticed this as well. The Jets have an ability to sort of compensate when something isn't working, right? If the goaltending in a given game maybe isn't great, the offense and depth scoring has usually made up for it. If the depth scoring struggles, your power play and maybe some of your star talent can carry the night. If your star talent's struggling, well, guess what? Lowry's line has really anteed up and become a really indispensable part of this scoring unit. And, the Nemesnikov line, for whatever issues it may have, is still scoring, out the wazoo at this point. So it seems like the Jets have this really interesting rotating cast of heroes of the night. The Jets have played from behind in a lot of these games. They have come back and won almost everything. It's been a really impressive performance to start the season. And I think more than anything, it really shows that this team has a level of grit and fight back that maybe in other years we haven't seen. And I do mention this every so often when the Jets have shown it. I think that they showed it under Bonus at times. I think that there were games under Maurice that we saw it too. But basically from the start of the season, from puck drop this year, the very first puck drop, it felt like the Jets have been trying to really go all out effort wise and fight for almost every shift. Not every player I think has exemplified this perfectly, but like even Logan Stanley, who we occasionally see have some errors out there, still leaves his heart out on the ice, whether he's doing well or not. There's never been a question about his effort, right? So this team is really trending in the right direction. And I think going into the trade deadline this year, it's going to be really interesting to see what the Jets do. Right now it's way too early to know who's even on the market. But if you ask me, this season feels like a year where the Jets should add. And I don't mean that because you want to break something that's working, but I think this team deserves an acquisition. I think it's proven that it's ready for, moving on beyond the regular season. The regular season to this team doesn't really mean that much because they continually make the playoffs. I think that's the one thing that maybe goes under the radar with Winnipeg is that when it comes to the regular season, they've got that formula locked down. They make the playoffs, and then it's what happens in the playoffs that's usually been the Achilles heel. So if ever there was a year where I think the Jets might be wise to make some additions, this could be the season. You look at the playoff field right now, and again, it's only 12 to 13 games in, so let's not read too much into it. But how many teams do you think have Winnipeg's balance? Not many. The Stars are good, but they're not immortal. The Avs are really banged up and probably won't be fully healed by the playoffs. Who else? The Knights are probably the strongest team outside of Winnipeg right now. You've got the Panthers and Rangers. I think the Rangers are another team that probably fits in that category, but they've slumped the past couple of games. All that said, on paper, still a phenomenal team. The Panthers are a cup winner. They're still very good. And so there's a handful of really good opponents. But when you think about the pathway to getting towards the cup, the Jets could actually have all things being equal, one of the easier routes that they've had, compared to previous years where there was an immediate buzzsaw in round one, which makes me think that the Jets might be well positioned to bring in some help. As it is, this team is doing really well, and I think it's going to, only continue to improve as the weeks wear on. It feels like guys are getting more on the same page. But you think about what could potentially improve this team. Maybe you look at like a Broccoli or something. That's certainly an option. Maybe Claude Giroux could come in. Giroux, I'm, maybe a little ambivalent on just because I think this team probably wants to lead into a speedier identity, and I don't know that he's going to help there. But maybe, a Morgan Frost or a Sean Couturier might become available. I think the Jets could go in any number of directions. I think that Winnipeg could figure out something, whether it's bolstering their center depth, maybe looking at a defender somewhere. I think this team has a whole host of options available to it, and they've got the resources to make something happen. This team is in a very unique position of having a really good team in a lot of categories. In my mind, they've got the best power play. I think it's ranked number one. And I think with the way it plays, it's definitely number one. They've got a top 10 PK unit that's done really well for the most part. You've got a goaltending tandem that, at the end of the year is probably going to be fighting for a Vezina trophy. You've got a forward group that's pretty deep up and down the lineup. Maybe you could quibble about how it's arranged, and perhaps we'll see some changes over the course of the season, but it's pretty good as is. And it could certainly serve as a great template if you wanted to make an acquisition somewhere to bolster this group even further. And I know that there will be some folks who say, well, you don't have to make changes if the team is doing well. And that's true. I think that there's merit to not always breaking something that works. But in the case of this team, I would almost call it a reward. If you make an acquisition of like a big player, somebody who can be a huge rental for this team, I wouldn't look at it as something that's negative. I'd almost say like the players are looking for somebody who can help them move even further into the playoffs, get past that first round, even get past one win and move on to something greater. Because this team, to me, is already setting itself up for a great rest of the year. And now it's kind of time, or it will be time in a few weeks and in a few months to start talking about how this team might be in the playoffs. I think this team really could go in any number of directions, and it's why this year is very interesting. I thought that there would be more of a growth period, but it seems like they've just hit the ground running. And so from here, you have the world's really your oyster. You could do almost anything, and that's probably exciting for a lot of people, maybe a little bit, anxiety inducing for others. I think it could be great for the Jets. 22 points banked already with the chance to bank even more this week, especially against Central Division opponents. Sign me up. Now, at the core of all of this has been Scott Arniel, and I thought it'd be worth reflecting a little bit on what his first few games have been like, where he seems to be doing really well, what I'd maybe want to see a little more out of from him so far, which admittedly is pretty limited, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we go any further, thought it might be worth shouting out our friends and partners at Indeed. When it comes to searching for talent out there, the best way to hire isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed because they help you ditch the busy work. You can use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster without going through all of the unnecessary steps. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. I've used Indeed when I was looking for work, can personally attest to how detailed it is, how easy the resume builder is, and when I get job recommendations, it actually applies to both my former disciplines and, my salary requirements. Instead of wasting time connecting me with jobs that just didn't really fit or make sense, Indeed hooked me up with stuff immediately from the first search that matched my interests. And if you're an employer, I have to imagine that this means that you're getting a great pool of quality candidates immediately. 3.5 million businesses worldwide already use Indeed, and I highly recommend that you join them. Listeners of this show will even get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying that you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Also wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win that first bet. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. You can check the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets. If you're getting in the hunch in the middle of the game, whether it's maybe the upcoming Ravens versus Bengals game, I will be very anxious that whole night, but I'm hoping for a big victory. Or maybe you're thinking about something with the Vikings or the Packers. Maybe even you're a Raiders fan, and maybe the season hasn't gone that well, but you have a hope for the recently fired staff to be replaced by competent folks, and you're looking for a big gamble on a team that you're hoping maybe somehow touches a playoff spot. You could win big by going with FanDuel. And again, all you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to join right now. Again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's all at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us in tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about, the Jets recently, how they've done so far this year. And I think it's about time we turned our attention to Scott Arniel and really talk about his early stewardship for Winnipeg because, by and large, I think he's done a very good job. I've maybe made some critical comments in the past, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, pretty minor quibbles. I know I mentioned earlier this year that I was thinking the Jets running it back would be a mistake. I feel like that's maybe not the right way to frame it either, because the Jets, to be honest, haven't necessarily run it back roster-wise, yes. But in terms of the coaching staff selections, I think that's where there's been a huge overhaul, and it's made an immediate impact. The special teams difference between this year and previous seasons is almost night and day. We haven't had a power play this good in 6 or 7 years. We haven't had a PK this good since the first year of Bonus's coaching tenure, which that PK was only average. Winnipeg's PK this year is up there, I would say, around the top 10 in units so far. Again, it is a small sample size, but we're starting to get to the point where, 15, 20, 25 games, you're starting to get a sense of what a team really is like. And so far, the Jets seem to be firing on all cylinders. I think the thing that I was maybe concerned about was the even strength play, but even that seems to have been picked up recently. And I think what's sort of beneficial to the Jets is that league-wide, there's just not that many teams that scare you. You look at Vegas as maybe being one of the tougher opponents, and even they've had a few losses to start the year. The Devils have played pretty good hockey, but again, they've played like 15 games already, thanks to that global series that they had at the start of the season, and they're fine. The Panthers and the Rangers are pretty dang good, but I feel like the Jets have a really good foundation to build from. And Arniel's up-tempo style, while adopting many of the same defensive principles that he had under Bonus, seems to have been a good fusion. And what I think I appreciate with him is that, when the Jets struggle, he gives them a chance for redemption. Even if I feel like Winnipeg maybe should make a top line switch at some point, he still wants to give them a chance to right the ship themselves, which is, from a leadership perspective, I think a good trait to have, right? If you trust your players and if you want them to trust you, then ultimately it probably makes the most sense to let the guys go through their troubles. And if they really can't figure it out, then you step in and be the coach. But so far, he hasn't really had to do that. When he did, that line had a very good follow-up game after that Toronto game, right? The Toronto game was a complete disaster. We all know everyone really sucked. And I think they got the message. The next game against Detroit, I think it was, totally different experience, very different performance, night and day almost. And I get it, the Red Wings may not be the most imposing opponent, but at the same time, you don't pick your schedule. You still got to show up and you've still got to outplay your opponents. And the Red Wings are a team that's actually thinking of trying to make the playoffs. In fact, they're only 3 points out of, the top of the Atlantic right now, so it's not like it's inconceivable that they make it, which, for the Jets is good. Like, if you continue to put down teams that conceivably, if you somehow make it all the way through to the Stanley Cup Finals, you could see those opponents. Putting them down early, not exactly the worst thing. The Jets also right now have the highest scoring offense and generally one of the fewest goals conceded. They do not have the lowest goals against total. That currently belongs to like the Rangers and Carolina Hurricanes. But I mean, they already won the Jennings Trophy last year, so who cares, right? The most important thing is that the Jets continue to have a really good balance in all sectors of the game. And so far, Arniel has done a great job. Whoever, again, recommended Chenoweth and Payne should seriously get a finder's fee from Winnipeg. They have been an absolute godsend to this team, and I really hope that they continue their great work. The difference has been noticeable. Maybe on the defensive side, you see less of a change just because the Jets already had a good defensive structure, but the PK, most certainly very improved. The power play, lights out. And Arniel, I think, did a good job in selecting these folks. I think, that side of his personnel management has been great. And so really from Arniel, if there's anything I would even ask for going forward, just to be open-minded if this team ever does encounter skids. Inevitably, you will have something happen. It just is the way of the game, right? Injuries are probably the most likely scenario. Ehlers and Connor have missed time recently. Scheifele's missed time. At any point, you could lose somebody important. And so it's always good to keep some tactical flexibility. I think that we've already seen Arniel sort of mess with things and make some or send some messages early on this year is a good sign that he's thinking about the same things, but that so long as the team is winning, he doesn't want to interfere and get in the way. And maybe that's a good lesson for me as well, where he is going to do the right balance, right? He wants to strike a good balance that doesn't piss off the room. And so far, I think he's really, leveled up to that challenge. So all props to him. I think he's had a really good start. I don't know where this tenure ends. I don't know if this team is going to suddenly fall out in the second half. I would really be surprised if this team does. I don't get this vibe with the squad. This Jets team seems pretty consistent. They seem to be winning in a good amount of ways to where you don't really worry about the post-break swoon that's hit the team the last few years. I don't really see that happening. I mean, it could, but I don't know. I don't get that vibe with this team. Do I think that they're only going to have like 10 losses on the year? No. They probably will finish with like a 50-ish, maybe like 20-10 record or something. somewhere in that neighborhood, right? But I mean, I think this team's pretty dang good. They've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're starting to really sustain this level of victories. Not everything, is perfect, and it doesn't have to be. That's what you spend the rest of the year working on and getting there. But the fact that they've already built themselves such a huge margin for error early on the season is great. It means you can experiment. It means you can think about tweaking things. And, in a really competitive Central Division where your worst teams are like Chicago, Colorado, and Nashville. You heard that right, Chicago, Colorado, and Nashville right now. You can kind of tell that this year's division is going to be a bit of a pain. Winnipeg is only 4 points ahead of Minnesota, and they've got a game in hand. So Winnipeg building such an early cushion is great. The Wild look like they're going to be a huge pain in the butt this year. The Stars at some point will probably pick up their level of play. And we all know that, between Utah and St. Louis, one of these teams will probably be a pain in the butt. And I can't see, both of Colorado and Nashville staying in the bottom of the division forever. Somebody's going to ascend at some point. It's just a question of when. So for Winnipeg, for Arniel, I think that this couldn't really have gone better. The best start in franchise history, and it doesn't feel like it's an illusion, which I think is maybe the happiest thing. Now, amidst all of this, I think it probably is also worth giving some players some credit. There may be a guy or two here that I've mentioned before, but I'll give some roses to folks that maybe haven't traditionally shouted out in just a quick moment. But before we get into that, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in rewarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports available to everyone. You just pick more or less than at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. And you don't have to worry if your player, if somebody in your lineup gets hurt in the middle of the game, your lineup will still stay active. It's great. It's a wonderful insurance option. And if you're wondering why PrizePicks is a better choice than anywhere else, they always put their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. You can get your winnings in as little as 15 minutes. They even offer Venmo now for quick and easy deposits and withdrawals into your account, so you can get in on the action as quickly as possible. If you sign up today, you'll even get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50. It's just guaranteed. If you're thinking in tomorrow's upcoming game against Utah, I would say if you're thinking like Kyle Connor points, 1.5, I would go over. I think he's going to get more than that. If you were thinking about maybe, actually defenseman scoring too could be a really good one. The Jets blue line's been very active. I would say, I don't know if there's a bet for this one, but it might be worth taking a look at, Jets defenders, 2.5 points. I would say over that. The Jets defense has been very aggressive. They've been collecting tons of contributions. Might be a safe bet. But if you want to get in on the action, download the app today and use code LOCKEDON to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just talking about some underrated Jets perhaps and folks who I think have, really stood up and answered the call for better performances or just have impressed me with their efforts, something along those lines. Obviously, Kyle Connor is going to be, one of the easiest choices, but I'm thinking about a couple of other guys this time. I think there are a few players that deserve some real credit. Mason Appleton, I think, has really done a great job alongside Niederreiter and Lowry. In the past, I've kind of thought that Appleton maybe had a tendency to occasionally kill some offensive plays. This year, I feel like he's been a lot more supportive, and he's been a really good standout so far. I think he's been he's found himself in good scoring areas. He's making smart plays. He's not really a defensive stalwart, but he's offering some good, forechecking and back checking ability. He's just taking off all the boxes of what you'd ask for. And I think in the role that he's now been cast in, which is like, a 14.5-minute night kind of guy, he's been doing a great job. I think in the past he was overplayed, but in this role he's done much better, and I've come away feeling pretty happy with this game. So, good on Mason. I think he's had a really good start to the year. Very curious to know if he spends the whole season here. He's a contract expiration situation that's coming up. And, with him being, closer to 30 and the Jets maybe having a lot more young players coming into the fold that might be able to step into his position, I almost wonder if he's more of like an internal rental. I wouldn't hate it if they ended up re-signing him at a relatively reasonable contract. But by the same token, I look at this and I'm like, I don't know that the Jets should re-sign Mason because I feel like he deserves to get the bag. He's put in a really good shift. He's having a career start to his season. And I just feel like, what? If the Jets aren't able to afford him, let him go chase the bag somewhere and get a big contract. He deserves it. It's great. I always root for guys to succeed once they leave the Jets, unless, of course, it's Rucker McGroarty. Him not doing well with the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins is still funny to me. Sorry, I'm a little petty about that, but it is what it is. Another guy that really deserves some love and who has had a bit of a mixed start to the year, it's going to be Dylan Sandberg. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, he's been terrible to start the year. And I think Sandberg has had to bear a lot more on his shoulders than he's ever had before. Let's be real. He's playing alongside Neil Pionk. And I think people don't fully understand at times that a lot of the reason that Pionk is over a point per game right now is because Sandberg is shouldering all of the defensive load. He has become Pionk's safety valve, and it's let Neil basically cut loose in a way that he's never been able to do really ever. I don't think he's ever been this freely aggressive, not since the bubble year, maybe. And even then, I don't remember him being this offensively activated and involved. This is like him just being a fourth forward. And that means that Sandberg is basically the only guy back in a lot of scenarios, which puts a lot of strain on him. And yet he has generally done about as well as anybody could possibly ask for a player who's being asked to be, the defender in his pairing. And what's really impressive about Sandberg is that, despite there being some really bad games in here, he has generally rebounded very quickly. Following the Toronto game, he looked like he didn't even have the worst game of his career in the Detroit game. He looked completely comfortable. He's even potted himself a couple of goals this year, which is really funny. He never scores, and he already has 3 goals, which is crazy. That's like a complete anomaly. This is a guy, mind you, that just doesn't score goals at all. In fact, I don't know if he had more than a couple last year. He had 1 goal last year and 2 goals the year prior. So that's really funny. He's already got 3 this year. Maybe he's turned a new shooting corner. He should just keep banking it off the backboards. Apparently that's how he scores. But again, for a guy who I think has had to really change how he plays and become, Pionk's anchor, so to speak, I would say that he really deserves a huge shout out. Also going to give a big shout out to Colin Miller, who's been great. Whether he's played with Fleury or Stanley, it really hasn't made a difference. I would actually say that Miller right now might be our best right-sided guy outside of Pionk. And like Neil, defensively, we all know kind of gives up a lot, but, offensively, he's been able to contribute even more. I would say Miller is generally good at both. You'll still see some moments where he gets flat-footed, and that's gotten him into some trouble every now and then. But for the most part, again, it's just hard to complain. When I say or offer a critique, for the most part, I think the context is important to keep in mind that I'm generally being nitpicky, right? This is the hardcore analysis lens. And for the most part, I really don't have too much to say bad about anyone so far. Even Stanley in his last game, I think, did fine. I think the thing with Stanley that we all know is that admittedly when he gets, mashed up against agile skaters in the corners and stuff, you see some of the defensive issues kind of pop up. But so long as he's able to contribute offensively and still be a strong breakout passer when he's, making those stretch plays, I don't really feel like I should complain. But otherwise, this team, I think, has just really stepped up collectively. The Lowry line's paving the way. The Kupari line has been great. I know that the Kupari line basically hasn't scored at all. And I feel like at times they're maybe a little unlucky to be a net negative right now. But eventually I do expect that dam to break. Barron's not going to stay there with only 1 point for long. He will get something at some point over the next couple of games. It just feels like it's a matter of time. But again, what a start to the year. really impressed with a lot of guys who have turned the corner this season. I think we've seen a more engaged Scheifele last game. Connor is playing at a very elite level. Ehlers is starting to turn his season around. So it just feels like everyone's kind of starting to fire on all four cylinders, and the players that the Jets need to step up have started to do so. It makes the upcoming offseason really interesting because we've got some really big free agents over the next year or two, and I'm very curious to know how Winnipeg navigates those waters. But all in all, it is what it is. We'll get there when we'll cross that bridge when we get there, right? But let me know what you think of Arniel's start. Are you happy with him? What do you think of his performance as head coach so far? What do you think of Winnipeg's start to the season? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow, look for a recap of Winnipeg versus Utah. Should be a very exciting game. Utah apparently has tried to shell up a little more defensively, so it'll be interesting to see if their low event style after a very fast and frenetic start is a problem for the Jets. I suspect not. I think Winnipeg's going to be just fine, but we'll see then. Again, if they lose a game somehow, who even cares? The Jets are going to be 11-2. Really can't complain about that start at all. But again, we'll see you then. As always, thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.